for a primary product producer, it obviously is going to drive up the value of land and mineral sites and the rents coming off those activities. And those, of course, are held in concentration. And if they're held in concentration, it means those at the top will gain. A very big price boom will generate a very big increase in rents on those activities, a very big increase in wealth of those at the top, and immense increases in inequality. This assertion, modern economists have looked at contemporary evidence and have not seen as close a connection between going global and its impact on distribution as theory typically predicts. There's no problem when you're looking at the 19th century. It's very clear, and the evidences we're going to see when I lecture on that in a few lectures down the way, you're going to see how dramatic it is. The impact of going global, getting a positive price shock for your primary product exports, what it does to inequality. It's profound. And then you can only imagine what that would do to attitudes towards accumulation and innovation on the one hand and rent-seeking on the other. It's going to tend to give power to those who favor the rent-seeking as opposed to education and improvements in human capital and all the rest. So that may be another source of a negative impact might be associated with going global if you're a primary product exporter. So more asymmetry that we might expect. All right, well, okay, theory seems straightforward, but you know, anybody can theorize, and what about the evidence? So here's this great historical database that I put together, which I wish the Philippines were better represented in. So those of you out there, young people with empirical interests, get to work. Got to improve the long-run database for the Philippines to confront a lot of these questions, though it is in the sample. So we got these core leaders, Austria, Hungary, France, Germany, blah, blah, blah. And then there are 8 in the European poor lagging, at least in most of the 19th century, laggards, Russia, the Iberians, and so on. 8 Latin American countries are in the sample, 10 Asia and Middle East, and there's the Philippines, 3 English-speaking offshoots, and big share of the other world that I'm observing. And all one has to do is to do the algebra, lay it out, do the econometrics, make sure you satisfy your referees by doing every instrumental variable you can imagine and throwing away members of the sample that they think are outliers. And when you're done, you finally get this result. This is a stripped-down version that will show you the empirical result. When you look at this is looking at the evidence. The purpose is to explain per capita GDP growth performance in real terms for all of these countries over time, from 1870 to 1939. Okay. Can you read that? That is the key result. Remember, I was just going to do this again, asserting asymmetry, and we've got it. In terms of the impact of a growth, of a secular improvement in your terms of trade, on your performance, growth performance, for the core countries, that is the rich, for the rich industrial countries, the number is positive and significant. So those trading partners who are industrial and exporting manufacturers definitely gain from an improvement in their terms of trade. That, however, is not true of the poor periphery. The estimate is much lower, but in any case is insignificant. So it appears the empirical evidence confirms that, yes, there are gains from trade, that this period of growth for the poor periphery, it is true that they get gains from trade. But the dynamic effects apparently offset it. And the dynamic effects apparently being price volatility and all the other things, deindustrialization that we've talked about. So there's that poor performance. Now you look at the volatility effect. It has no effect on growth performance of the core. If a core country has high volatility, it doesn't have a very significant impact on its growth performance. That is not true of the periphery. It has a very profound impact, negative impact on the growth performance. That's the growth performance we're trying to explain. It was this half-point difference in growth between the poor and the rich countries, creating the great divergence. And those numbers tell you how much of it can be explained by these global forces. And the answer is a lot, at least over that period, 1870 and 1913. A lot of it can be explained by those growth forces. So you can do the econometrics. The evidence is good enough, so you can do the econometrics for that period, 1870 and for 1939. But what about prior to 1870? And that's kind of crucial because that's where a lot of Arthur Lewis spent most of his, he got a Nobel Prize too. And he spent most of his focus on the period 1870 to 1939. But as you've seen, the big improvement, the big boom in the primary product terms of trade took place prior to 1870, not after. So we should be looking at that. Well, too bad. The evidence is lousy. And so you just can't do it the way you want to do it. You can't do the econometrics. But why should things be any different? I don't see any reason why I wouldn't expect the same results in looking at that period if I had better data. And I do know the terms of trade volatility was at least as big, maybe even bigger, prior to 1870 than after. So that negative impact on growth is going to be big. There it is. Those numbers, that 9.176, is a bigger measure of volatility on the prices on average for the periphery than you saw for after 1870. So we know price volatility was even bigger prior to 1870. So if we saw a negative impact on growth after 1870, why shouldn't we see it prior to 1870? And there now, Nancy, would you answer that, please? And there's the Philippines. Now, as you can see, up to 1870, it is one of the prize winners in terms of volatility on the prices of their exports, and therefore are very negative, tending to hold down growth performance as a result. So that's volatility and the secular improvement. And you've already seen evidence that the deindustrialization effects are most pronounced over the period up to the 1870s. So it's just likely, it seems to me, that what you've seen for the period after 1870, where globalization tends to contribute to the widening gap between rich and poor countries, was even more dramatic prior to 1870. Just to remind you, there's that terms of trade boom and bust. And all of the econometric evidence, is this going to do this again? It's dealing with that period. And this period is more dramatic in terms of the secular improvement. So I'm guessing that when the evidence, after I'm dead and clever people have gotten the evidence, they're going to confirm this assertion. Okay. So what are the bottom lines from all of this? First, did globalization contribute to the Great Divergence before 1940? No doubt about it. Yes, it did. No doubt about that. How much of the gap in the exploding gap between rich and poor countries can be explained by different secular changes in the terms of trade and its volatility? And the answer is big. Maybe a half. I'll be modest and say a third. So a very big share is not going to be explained by culture and institutions. It's going to be explained by these global forces. Would I expect the same thing to be true prior to 1870? Well, I've argued that I expect, if I had the evidence, I'm just expecting it would be even bigger for that period. So what are the lessons for us for today? I'm supposed to do that if I'm going to have some value. So would I expect the same thing today after those 6 decades, since we've gone open again after 1950? The world has become integrated again like it was up to 1913 in what I call the second global century. Would I expect to see the same thing? By the same thing, I mean, would today going global for a country that exports primary products as one of its exports, would I expect this kind of less powerful impact on growth than we see for those who are exporting manufacturers? The answer is no, I don't. And the reason why not is that industrial order has kind of disappeared from the globe. Maybe not in Africa, but it is diminishing there too. What I mean by that is they now export labor-intensive manufactures. They're doing what Britain did, in 1850. So here's a World Bank plot of shares, the mix of the average periphery country, with this one being the share of exports that are manufacturers. It's just spectacular what's happened to that proportion, right? And with the share of the exports being manufacturers coming out of the so-called third world. So it's no longer true that the poor periphery, Africa may be the exception to the rule, is dependent on primary products like it was in the first global century. So the dynamics may be a little different than what we've seen in the previous history. But here are some more lessons. Why isn't this there? Well, what about the commodity price booms we've seen since the 1990s? Driven, we think, by the spectacular growth of the BRICS. How will that play out? Well, it's certainly going to raise the relative price of primary products. It's going to raise the price of fuels. It's going to raise the price of intermediates. It's going to raise the price of food. And that's the way you should bet in the future. But what we don't know is whether the BRICS will have a growth record anything like Europe and its offshoots did, that is, having 70 years of impressive growth. Everybody predicts China is going to have a growth slowdown, less so in India perhaps. Don't know so much about Brazil, but it seems clear that those double-digit growth rates are not going to be maintained. They're going to slow down, and certainly my part of the world is going to slow down a lot as we age. So the forces may not be likely to persist quite so long, as was true of the case in the past. But it's also true that Latin America and Africa and other countries like the US and the Philippines are better able to exploit a price boom than they were in the past. And that may be the key question, whether or not they will and whether or not the Philippines will. So those are the takeaways I give you.